Hey everyone, welcome to FabForge 5. I'm glad you're here. We design and build fun and unusual things, and we always learn something new along the way. This is episode 4 of our Spaceship in a Bottle build. First episode, we built a bottle cutter, cut open our bottle. Second episode, we got our electronics working, including a really cool mini vintage CRT. Episode 3, the last episode, we got a bunch of acrylic parts laser cut, did some 3D printing. Now we have all our parts and electronics together. It's time to put this thing together. Let's get started.
FabForge 5.
All right, we need to harvest some parts first to use for part of the parts of our spaceship. So first, here's an old disk drive from a laptop that stopped working. So inside you can see the disk platter, but here's the read head, or the read heads for the disk platter. I like how these look. They look kind of like the back of a spaceship seat. So we'll use this for our seat. And then here's an old floppy drive, broken, looks like this. Inside it has a brushless DC motor which spins the floppy, and those look like this. I like how these things look. They're kind of futuristic. Those would be great for another little prop inside our spaceship, so we'll harvest that too. So here's all the parts we made in our last couple of videos: acrylic laser cut parts, our 3D printed parts, our electronics, and here's the bottle that we cut in our very first video. Now, one thing I realized with the spaceship deck, here's the rear bulkhead, they don't fit. So as hard as I try sometimes to design things correctly in Fusion 360, sometimes I make a mistake. So I redid the deck and made a mistake again. Now it fits too far down. So fail number 2. So we'll try redoing deck number 3. I had to redo the bulkhead too. So here's a new bulkhead. Now here is the third deck design. I'll go ahead and peel off the paper. It's actually kind of fun to peel off the paper after you laser cut apart. There we go. Leaves a nice clean look for the laser cut acrylic. Now we'll test our revised bulkhead, and you can see it fits just right. Alright, so now we've got to start putting some things together. Start with the Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi, its entire operating system, all its files, its programs exist on one SD card. Fits right here. Very convenient that way. You can clone that SD card and add it to all the Raspberry Pis that you want. It'll all run the same program for you. Now we'll mount this onto our deck. It sits on the lower part of our deck. Kind of hidden away, but still a bit visible. And by the way, this is a Raspberry Pi Zero. It's a nice small footprint, but still has most of the horsepower of a regular Raspberry Pi. They don't cost very much. Here's our brushless DC motor coil. That goes onto our thruster plate. I'll mount it just like this with its little hub that it came with. And I'll get that all squared away. There we go. That's looking good. All right, now we're going to go ahead and do a bit of assembly here finally. Get our rear bulkhead connected. Now these mount actually with some number 2 screws, and I use some nice little captive nuts, and I'll show you how they work. They slide in a little gap or slot in the back of the bulkhead. Easy to laser cut this. It gets held right there so it doesn't spin. And then we'll put our deck plate on. Put a machine screw through the hole in the deck plate and fasten them together. I use this type of connection a lot for these types of parts. It's easy to design and it's really forgiving too. And it's nice and sturdy. All right, now we need to add our thruster plate onto our chassis. The chassis is one of the items that we used our acrylic bender last time. We use a Circuit Playground Express for some more effects. So this basically controls the NeoPixels that light up the engine nozzles and a few other things you'll see in a bit. This mounts on with some screws. I always make sure that I laser cut the holes just the right size in the acrylic so the screws are self-tapping into the acrylic. You don't need extra fasteners that way. All right, and here's our little, what would you call these? Our thruster beams. I put a little slot in them to let it slide tightly into the slot like that and not fall out. That little spline or slot in them lets them compress a bit, makes them a little springy, and holds them in place. Works pretty well. So we got our 3 trusses on. Now we'll add our assembly here. Trusses go into those 3 slots. And the fronts of the chassis slides into the slot in the deck. A little tricky to get all these in, but they eventually fit. Just like that. Now we need to mount our chassis to the bottom of our deck. I made some little 3D printed spacers, just the right length for that. And we screw it into the deck. All right, that's all mounted. Now I took off the front bulkhead just briefly here. It fits like this, but we're not going to put it on yet because we want to put in our vintage CRT. So it fits into the slot right there in the control panel. And then the PCB on the vintage CRT doesn't really have any holes in it I can mount onto the bottom deck. So I'm just going to glue it with some E6000 glue. That always works great. And it's relatively clear, so it's kind of hard to notice unless you're really looking for it in an application like this. By the way, one reason for having all the hexagon cutouts in the deck, first, they look cool. Second, they give the Raspberry Pi a little bit of airflow because it does heat up a bit when it's being used. We'll talk about that in a bit when we look at how much current this whole thing actually takes. So we'll clamp the PCB down, let it dry, make sure everything's in the right place. And yeah, I do love how these vintage CRTs look. They're very spaceship-y, I guess. All right, we'll let that dry. Now here's our 3D printed flexible filament seat back. We'll use some E6000 to glue that onto the nice little disk drive assembly we got before. That's our seat back. Looks just like that. To me, it looks kind of futuristic. I like the look of that. Plus, it's got just about the right curve for a seat back too. Let that dry. Now we got to do some soldering connections for our CRT. So we'll connect the video in to the TV out connector on our Raspberry Pi. And now we need to connect some rails up on our overall assembly for our 5 volts and our ground. So to do that, first we're going to place this inside our bottle. Make sure it's exactly centered. I temporarily put the 3 black thruster gaskets, I guess you would call them, on there to help me center this whole assembly. Then we're going to take some regular old brass, what would you call them, fasteners you get in stationery stores. They're used to fasten a bunch of pieces of paper together. These things are great. They're flexible, they work well, you can solder onto the brass. They're a really nice way to make a specialized connector. So I clipped off one of the little leaves there, I guess you would call it. Pre-tin the ground and power sections of our Circuit Playground Express. I'll pre-tin the brass connector. Then you'll see how we do this. So I want to be able to seal up the bottle, but still have access to the power and ground connections, obviously, because that power is going to come from outside the bottle. So this is the way I finally figured out how to do this. So once the bottle's sealed, this brass is so thin, it doesn't really make a difference for the bottle. You won't be able to tell that there's a gap at all from the bottom and the top of the bottle. But we've got these nice little brass buttons now that we can connect power to. By the way, the V out, that's the 5 volt power for the Circuit Playground Express. So we'll solder both of these guys in there. And they look just like that. So we can still seal up our bottle. We'll still have 2 nice little buttons for our power connections. All right, now we're going to add some power rails onto this. So you'll see how we do that. It just makes it really convenient to connect all the different power connections. So I want those rails to run from the buttons we just added up toward the front. We'll use a 1/16 inch brass rod. Easy to solder, easy to bend, just the right size for this. I'll make a 90-degree bend in one end of it. Just like that. Now that slides into one of the laser cut holes in our deck. Just like this. And then it will come back and we'll solder that onto one of the brass power strips, I guess we'll call them. So we'll cut it to the right size. Make sure everything's aligned in the right place. And then we'll solder this onto our brass strip. This thin brass, small brass, is really easy to solder. Regular soldering iron, regular temperature. It's not too big, so it doesn't take too much heat. Alright, there's that. So now this entire brass rod on that side is the plus 5 volts. Now we'll add one on the other side for our ground. Get it just in the right place. Get this soldered on. Quick and easy. Alright, now we've got some nice power rails. We're going to want to connect our Raspberry Pi, a bunch of different LEDs, etc. And those rails make it a lot more convenient. Plus they look kind of cool. Imagine them as some kind of fuel tube inside the spacecraft, I guess. So here's the ground connection from our CRT. I cut it a little bit short, but it'll work. And now we can connect the +5 and ground connections from our Raspberry Pi. Then we can power it up to see if it works. Now, just turn on our power supply, set it for 5 volts, connect it to our 2 power strip inputs, turn it on and see how things work. So we've got a working CRT. Let's make sure our Raspberry Pi works. And there you can see Raspberry Pi is booting up on the CRT. That's great. And our Circuit Playground Express is kind of showing the flickering lights we want to use for our nozzle lighting. So we're good. Now I want to add a green LED. This runs on 3.3 volts. Looks like this. We have a few places we can grab 3.3 volts from, regulated, from either our Raspberry Pi or our Circuit Playground Express. So I soldered it in to this little slot right here in our chassis, connected it to 3.3 volts out from the Raspberry Pi and over to our ground rail. Let's get that guy soldered really quick. There we go. Now we'll connect our power, turn it on, and see how this LED looks. And there we go. Now, what I hoped was true. It kind of creates a light pipe. So the bent acrylic pipes the light over to the edges of the console, which looks pretty cool. And in this space right here, we're going to do something special. We're going to emboss a neat thing there to make some gauges. You'll see that in the next video. Now we need some lights, some blue LEDs to light up our vacuum tubes, which kind of act like, I guess, tanks or reactors or something. They fit in 2 holes here in the rear bulkhead. So we'll go ahead and solder those together. We'll use one of our old design bulkheads as kind of a template. These run on 3.3 volts as well, so we'll pull that from our Circuit Playground Express, solder them together, and glue them into our rear bulkhead. And then when the glue's dry, we'll go ahead and solder those connections onto our power and ground. All right, we kind of ran out of time, so we'll stop here. We're almost done assembling our Spaceship in the Bottle. Next time, we'll bring everything together, put it inside the bottle, and seal it up and give it a try. Come back and watch for that, please. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video, subscribe so you can keep track of when I do my, my next video. And I'm really glad you spent some time with me today. So until I see you again, just take good care of each other. I'll see you later. Bye.